January 1984. The phone rings in Beverly Hills at 3:17 a.m. Isabel answers half asleep. On the line is her lawyer. His voice is unsteady. "They've filed suit," he says, "$40 million against you for one interview." She sits up slowly and looks around her one-room apartment. Unpaid electricity bills on the counter. A fridge that hums too loudly because it's almost empty. $40 million. For telling the truth on NBC. For saying out loud what really happens behind the gold gates of the Playboy Mansion. She thinks it must be a mistake. Lawsuits like that are for corporations, for rivals. Not for a former waitress with a 3-year-old son and no savings. But it isn't a mistake. Because this didn't start with television. It didn't start with lawyers or courtrooms. It started with a single photograph, and with a man who promised her everything, then quietly learned how to destroy her life. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. May 1980. The lunch rush at the Denny's off Belmont was a roar of plates and coffee, the fryer hissing like it was tired of living. Isabel St. John kept smiling, because smiling earned tips, and tips kept the lights on. When the owner pulled her aside and said, "No raise, not now," the number on her check, $3.85 an hour, felt like a wall. She'd been divorced 8 months. Tommy was 3. His daycare bill waited on the kitchen table beside an overdue gas notice. On her break, she opened the mail with a butter knife. Playboy Enterprises. An invitation to an open audition for Playboy bunnies in Chicago. Hotel ballroom. Date. Instructions written with corporate certainty. It arrived the same day she'd been denied a raise, and it didn't feel like fantasy. It felt like leverage. The audition looked nothing like the magazine. Fluorescents buzzed. A line of girls rapped past the elevators, 847 by someone's count, shifting on heels they hadn't broken in. Staff handed out numbers instead of names. Isabel became number 412. The woman in charge, Miss Carla, moved along the rows with a clipboard and a smile that worked like a lock. She stopped at Isabel, not for her face, but for the folder in her hands. Resume, references, and letters of recommendation. Carla's eyes sharpened. She leaned in and whispered, "Hefner likes smart ones." Then the system took over. Measurements with a tape-like inventory, posture checked against a wall, and a stamina test that was really a filter. Stand in heels for 45 minutes. No shifting, no complaint. The room was kept cold on purpose. Isabel held still until her calves burned, thinking about cough syrup and rent. At 11:40 p.m., her phone rang. A man's voice, smooth and confident, said, "Miss St. John, this is Hugh Hefner." Her throat tightened. "You were the only one who asked about medical insurance for your son. You're accepted. One condition." The line clicked before he explained. She sat down hard, staring at Tommy's toy truck, and waited for the second ring that never came. June brought her to 919 North Michigan Avenue. The Playboy Club Chicago looked expensive, even from the sidewalk. Valets, mirrored glass, men in suits who moved as if rules bent for them. Costume fitting wasn't glamorous. It was math. 23 measurements, pins, chalk, a uniform tailored to the millimeter. Miss Carla finally named the condition, VIP floor. Best money. Special clients. That first night, Blondie's "Call Me" thumped behind hidden speakers, while Isabel balanced trays in the VIP room, thick with cologne and cigar smoke. Near midnight, a small group entered, and the whole floor shifted. People made space without being told. Cameras flashed. In the center was Hugh Hefner. Isabel's pulse jumped, then fell. He scanned the line of bunnies as if they were part of the decor, nodded to Miss Carla, and walked past her. No recognition, no private signal. Isabel stood rigid under the music and understood, with a slow dread, that the voice on her phone hadn't been his. So who called her that night, and why did they know to mention her son? By the summer of 1981, Isabel understood the arithmetic. On paper, she earned more in a week than her mother had made in a month. $1,200, sometimes more. Cash nights meant envelopes, thick, quiet, passed not to her hands, but to Miss Carla's office. Tips were pooled, redistributed by a formula nobody saw. It worked as long as you didn't ask how it worked. They all signed the new non-disclosure agreement, 127 pages. The language was clinical and endless. Clauses folded inside clauses like traps that closed if you tried to read them too closely. Isabel initialed each page because Miss Carla stood behind her chair and because the daycare bill didn't care about legal theory. She learned the rhythm of the place, which clients tipped heavy, which wanted conversation, which wanted silence. The VIP floor taught her that control didn't need shouting. It needed systems. Names became numbers. Schedules became permissions. Even money moved sideways before it reached you. One afternoon, she returned to the office to drop off a pair of forgotten glasses. The door was half closed. Miss Carla's voice was low, practiced. A man spoke on speakerphone. "St. John is cleared," he said. "We can move her to the next phase." Carla paused. "Not yet," she replied. "She asks too many questions." Isabel stood frozen, then placed the glasses on the counter and left without being seen. The invitation arrived in September. A weekend in Los Angeles. Private flight. 12 girls. The mansion. The jet smelled of leather and champagne. Laughter came easily at 30,000 feet, but once the gates closed at the mansion, something shifted. The place was enormous, rooms branching like arteries, animals pacing behind discreet fences, a grotto that steamed even after dark. They were told to enjoy themselves. They were not told they couldn't leave. They simply couldn't. The first night, Hugh Hefner led a tour himself. He smiled as if the house breathed for him. In a locked room, he showed them archives, rows of cabinets, thousands of photographs, index cards filed with care. He stopped at one drawer and pulled a folder. Isabel's name was typed neatly. Inside were dates, addresses, notes, a photo of her son outside his preschool, medical information she hadn't shared. Hefner's smile didn't change. "We take care of our girls," he said. "We know everything." Mornings started late. Afternoons disappeared. Dinner at 7 was mandatory. Phones were borrowed, not owned. Refusal was framed as ingratitude. Isabel noticed women who had been there for years with no savings, no plans, no exit. She woke one night to crying. A girl named Lisa sobbed in the next room. Security arrived without urgency and escorted her out. By breakfast, Lisa was gone. The reason traveled in whispers. She'd asked when her promised shoot would happen. 8 months waiting had been too long. Kim, who had lived there 4 years, spoke softly by the pool. "The longer you stay, the more they know," she said, showing a contract with a penalty clause that could erase a life. $500,000 for silence. On the final evening, Hefner called Isabel into the library. He offered stability, $3,000 a month, a room, provisions for her son. All she had to do was sign a new contract. She asked for time. On the flight home, she opened her bag and found an envelope. Inside were photographs taken the day before. Her son near his school, caught by a long lens. A note rested on top. "We care about our girls' families." The signature was 2 letters. October 1982 arrived without ceremony. Isabel did not move to Los Angeles. She did not sign the new contract. She stayed in Chicago and kept her uniform. The answer came quietly and immediately. Her schedule changed. Day shifts. Lunch crowds. Businessmen who watched the clock. Her weekly pay fell to $400. No one explained it. No one had to. Punishment in this system was administrative. She learned to live with 2 lives that never touched. At work, she smiled, carried plates, remembered names. At home, she counted grocery receipts and kept the television low so Tommy wouldn't hear the news stories about glamour and success that no longer belonged to her. She understood now that the money had never been the reward. Compliance was. Susan found her on a Thursday afternoon between seatings. Mid-30s, tailored suit, voice precise. She said she was a lawyer. Said she represented 6 former Playboy models preparing a case. Said Isabel's name had come up because she hadn't moved west. Because she'd asked questions. Susan promised anonymity, protection, distance. Isabel didn't answer right away. She took the card and folded it into her apron pocket like something fragile. They met weeks later in a Holiday Inn conference room that smelled of carpet cleaner and burnt coffee. The women spoke carefully at first, then faster. Contracts that turned into debts. Fees no one remembered agreeing to. Years worked without savings to show for it. Meredith, pale and steady, said she owed $85,000 for training and housing she'd never seen itemized. Isabel listened and felt the room narrow. Susan laid out documents, numbers circled in red, money withheld, routed, reclassified. Independent contractors, the papers said. Control in practice, independence on paper. Isabel thought of the envelopes that never reached her hands. After that meeting, the street outside her apartment seemed louder. A black Cadillac sat across from her building 3 days in a row. At work, Miss Carla asked, smiling, how her legal friends were doing. Isabel's stomach tightened. The message sharpened one afternoon when Tommy didn't come out of school. Panic erased thought. Her mother answered the phone from Ohio, confused but calm. A man had come with identification, said there was an emergency. Tommy was safe. He was playing with blocks. Isabel sat on the curb and understood the language now. This was fluency. She was summoned to the Chicago office in February 1983. Hugh Hefner was there in person, rare enough to feel staged. He asked about her son, offered coffee, spoke warmly, then cooled the room. He mentioned reputation, safety. He placed a folder on the desk, photographs of Isabel entering the Holiday Inn, timestamps, room number. Then he smiled. Susan, he said, was not a lawyer. She was a journalist. NBC, using them all. Isabel checked. Susan disappeared. NBC denied her. Meredith insisted Susan was real, undercover. Truth fractured into versions. The offer came directly days later. NBC wanted an interview for Expose. $15,000. Shadows. Altered voice. April 12th. Isabel agreed because refusal felt like erasure. The night before, at 10:35, she found an envelope on her doorstep. 1 page, typed. Anonymity is an illusion. We know. Always. Last chance to reconsider. 2 initials. She locked the door and did not sleep. Morning came without rest. Isabel watched the clock crawl past 6 a.m., then dialed Ohio at 6:47. Her mother heard it immediately, the thin edge in her voice, and didn't ask questions. By 7:15, she was on the road to collect Tommy for a few weeks. Isabel packed quickly, hands steady only because there was no time to shake. At O'Hare, the terminal smelled of floor polish and burnt coffee. While boarding, Isabel saw him, Jack, security from the mansion, the same man who had escorted Lisa into the night. He sat reading a newspaper. When their eyes met, he smiled and folded it closed. The cover showed the April 1983 issue of Playboy. Isabel turned away. The message landed before the plane did. Burbank Studios felt refrigerated to the bone. Studio 3 was all angles and cables, efficiency without warmth. The producer explained silhouettes, voice modulation, the name she would borrow, Jane. 3 minutes before recording, a man in a gray suit entered with a document. NBC had received a legal notice. Playboy Enterprises. 40 minutes old. She signed another waiver because stopping now would mean the last 6 months had been for nothing. The interview lasted 37 minutes. Darkness. A single rim of light. Questions that cut cleanly. Isabel spoke about files, about money that moved without consent, about photographs that should never have existed. When she described finding the pictures of her son, the modulator couldn't hide the break. Silence followed that answer, heavy enough to be felt. Afterward, the producer offered a hotel near the studio. She agreed. Going back felt dangerous. The waiting became its own punishment. Days passed measured by phone calls home. Her son was fine. April 18th, 3:24 a.m. The phone rang once. A man's voice admired her chosen name. Then, nothing. On the 22nd, NBC warned of a second, harsher notice. On the 23rd, a reversal. A former Playboy accountant had documents. Double books. NBC would air. April 26th, 9 p.m. Eastern. Isabel watched from the edge of the hotel bed. 8.7 million viewers, the producer had said. At 9:27, someone knocked. She opened the door on the chain. A waiter handed her a silver tray. On it lay a magazine, April's cover again, marked in black ink. 41 minutes, cost $40 million. Invoice tomorrow. Initialed. The phone erupted. Praise, fear. At 11:55, an email forwarded from legal. Another notice. At 8:15 the next morning, a courier arrived. The lawsuit was thick, confident. Playboy Enterprises versus NBC Universal and Jane Doe, number 2. $40 million. Attached, a page titled Identification. Her name, her social security number, her room. Anonymity had never existed. They had always known. The first 48 hours stripped the shine from victory. At 9:30, the morning after the package arrived, Isabel called Ohio and begged her mother not to bring Tommy back. By 11, NBC's attorney, Margaret Chen, was in the room. Direct, fast, already outlining angles. The suit was dangerous, she said, but Playboy had overreached by naming Isabel before a public identification. It was a crack, not a door. By the next day, the crack widened into noise. Headlines framed the fight as spectacle. Reporters clustered outside Isabel's Chicago building. Neighbors called in a panic. Her name wasn't printed yet, but the description was enough. She watched the city she'd lived in turn curious, then hungry. The storm intensified in May. Support letters arrived by the hundreds, mixed with threats that smelled of ink and cheap anger. Organizations spoke up. Radio hosts joked. Then Hugh Hefner went on record, calm and paternal, describing Isabel as disappointed, unethical, compensated. He said he remembered her. The kindness was a blade. June brought the deposition. 9 hours under fluorescent lights at a top firm's office. The lead attorney worked methodically, receipts aligned like soldiers. He showed her checks, bonuses, the NDA she had signed. Then he played a security tape. Isabel laughing with a VIP client, perfectly composed. The implication hung there. Happy women don't claim fear. Margaret warned afterward that without documents, the case was thinning. Support faltered. The accountant withdrew after a settlement. Other women went silent. Then a call arrived from Patricia O'Connor, once a bunny mother in New York. They met in a public square. Patricia was elegant, worn. She had kept everything: diaries, memos, a 1972 protocol detailing how to manage problem employees. Names were signed at the top. The documents changed the temperature. Court accepted them. Playboy asked for time. The pressure escalated. Patricia received a visit, an offer, then a warning about grandchildren. Isabel felt the reach extend through walls. Allies appeared. Civil liberties lawyers filed briefs. A prominent feminist voice published a column. NBC received thousands of letters. Playboy responded with attrition, a new claim for training costs itemized into absurdity. Even if the main case failed, this could win. September opened with exhaustion. Isabel hadn't seen her son in months. Bills stacked. A daycare notice arrived overdue. She cried once, quietly, and went back to work on statements. 2 days before the next hearing, the offer came. Playboy would drop the $40 million. Isabel would retract publicly, sign a harsher NDA, and receive $75,000. 48 hours to decide. Margaret called it reasonable. Risk now was total loss. Isabel stared at a photograph of Tommy, 6 years old, missing teeth and patience. "If I refuse?" she asked. 11 seconds passed. "Then we go to the end," Margaret said. "Be ready to lose everything." Isabel closed her eyes. The choice didn't feel like courage. It felt like duty arguing with fear, and neither would yield. Isabel didn't sleep for 2 nights. At 8:47 on September 17th, Margaret called and waited. Isabel's voice was flat when she answered. She declined the settlement. Silence held. Then Margaret said, "Then we prepare for war." By mid-afternoon, Playboy issued a press release expressing regret that a generous offer had been rejected. The number, 75,000, was printed everywhere. Public opinion wobbled. Commentators wondered aloud what kind of woman refused that money. Reasonableness shifted away from her. Preparation became mechanical. Letters went out to hundreds of former employees. A handful replied. Fewer agreed to testify. Fear traveled faster than truth. On October 4th, Jennifer Marlowe arrived late, nervous, eyes scanning the street. She placed a cassette on the desk. The recording was old, rough, but unmistakable. A private party, 1978. A familiar voice explaining how silence was maintained after women left. Contracts, debts, knowledge of families. Insurance, he called it. Not threats, insurance. The law complicated everything. California required consent to record. Using the tape risked destroying its source. After long nights, they chose exposure over submission. The existence of the tape leaked. Playboy denied it. The story ran anyway. Trial began in November. Jury selection dragged. Most had heard of the case. Opening statements hardened the room. Playboy framed gratitude and betrayal. Margaret framed power and fear. Isabel testified for days. She described the files, the money, the photographs. When she reached that night, the envelope, the schoolyard images, her voice broke. A juror wiped her eyes. Cross-examination cut differently. Numbers, comparisons, smiles frozen on security footage. "You could leave," the attorney repeated. "Technically," Isabel said, and the words sounded small. Patricia testified next, bringing boxes of paper and memory. Midway through, a man entered and sat in the back. Patricia faltered. She recognized him immediately. The signature on the memo had a face now. During the break, He smiled and asked to be remembered. Her return was weaker. The defense pressed. A bank deposit was introduced. Doubt crept across the jury like a stain. Then, unexpectedly, the accountant returned. He admitted taking money to stay quiet. He produced copies he had kept anyway. Figures totaled millions withheld through invented fees. The defense attacked his credibility, his termination. The judge sustained objections, then allowed the documents. Playboy's final witness was a psychologist who had never met Isabel. He diagnosed instability from a distance. Margaret dismantled him in 3 questions. On November 29th, a surprise witness stood. She gave her real name and admitted the illegal recording. She handed over the original tape. The judge conferred, then allowed it with limits. The room exhaled. Closing arguments sharpened everything to motive. Silence versus speech. Control versus cost. The jury deliberated for hours, then overnight. They requested documents. They replayed the tape. At 4:20 p.m. the next day, they returned. Isabel gripped Margaret's hand as the clerk began to read. We find for the defendants, NBC Universal and Isabel St. John, on the claim of defamation. The room broke before the sentence finished. Isabel covered her face, breath leaving her in a rush she hadn't known she was holding. Margaret's arms were around her shoulders. Somewhere behind them, Patricia cried openly. For a brief, dangerous moment, it felt like winning. Then the clerk continued. On the claim of breach of non-disclosure agreement, we find for the plaintiff, Playboy Enterprises, and award damages in the amount of $127,000. The sound changed. Not cheers now, murmurs, pens scraping, a chair shifting. Isabel lowered her hands. The number sat between her and the exit like a wall. Truth had been accepted. Payment was required anyway. Headlines called it a split decision, a Pyrrhic victory. Editorials praised courage and warned of consequences. Feminist groups raised money fast, $31,000 in a week. But the demand letter arrived 12 days later, polite and exacting. 30 days, or collection, would begin. Hugh Hefner gave an interview in his own pages, magnanimous and calm. Doors open. Talented women. Regret. That same afternoon, Isabel received a handwritten letter on heavy paper. Congratulations on your victory. Freedom has a price. Careers remember. Children, too. The postscript promised permanence. January brought refusals. 23 interviews, no offers. Publicity was the reason, said quietly. Risk. She moved again. When Tommy returned after 9 months, he asked why they lived somewhere smaller, why kids said she'd been on television. She answered what she could. A literary agent called in February. A book could change the math. The law allowed it. Barely. The danger was obvious. Another war. Then another call. One of the witnesses had been followed. Old arrests resurfaced. Stories planted. The system still moved. In March, the accountant was found dead. Heart attack, said the police. His sister spoke of threats, photographs, nights without sleep. Isabel stood at the funeral and counted the ways courage could cost other people. She declined the book. When a final offer arrived, reduced debt, 5-year payments, lifelong silence, she signed. Capitulation felt like relief, only because the fight stopped. By September 1984, Isabel lived in a small Oregon town, earning $6.85 an hour at a library. She mailed $416 each month. Tommy learned spelling. He did not know the story. One afternoon, a letter arrived without a return address. A clipping announced the closure of the Playboy Club Chicago. A note thanked her. 15 women had quit, Replacements hadn't come. The system cracked. At sunset, Tommy asked what she'd done before. She said she'd worked in a restaurant. He asked if she liked it. She paused, then told him the truth she could afford, that she'd learned something important. What? That truth matters, she said, even when it costs. He nodded and ran back to his game. Isabel folded the letter and put it away with the verdict. Not a victory, not a defeat, something else. The price of truth, and the quiet proof it wasn't paid for nothing.